Lian Li have just released their most budget-friendly O11 to date, coming in at only $139.99 US. This is the O11 Vision. Now we have loads of experience building in all of the different types of O11s to date. So trust me when I say this could well be the best sub $150 case of 2023. This case has loads of upgraded features, tons of water cooling support, so let's take a look. The O11 Vision still follows its clean design from its brother and sister O11 variants. Lian Li wanted to create a case that further expands on the aesthetics of one's build. The main feature that makes the Vision what it is this top glass panel. Gives users the ability to view their PC from an angle never done before. But this top piece of glass is extremely unique in the fact that it has a reflective surface on the inside, so it actually makes your PC look larger, bigger, and more spectacular than it actually is. It's kind of like a PC Inception. Now, this highly reflective feature is not actually implemented on the front main window or the front glass panel. The case itself is primarily made from tempered glass with powder-coated metal panels and small bits of plastic like the feet and little accessories here and there. The case is primarily 480mm long, but 495 if you include the back power supply protrusion. The height of the case sits at 464mm and the width is 304mm. The front I/O panel includes USB Type-C, a microphone combo jack, and two USB 3 Type-A. And unlike a lot of other O11 variants, the position of the I/O is fixed in this particular case. Now, the rest of the I/O, including the power and reset, is actually located at the top back panel of the case. Now, the only dust filter included with the case is this pull-out panel right here. It simply slides out and is held in place by 4 magnets, one at each corner. The case box does not include any extra dust filters, so if you did want them, you could have a try at making your own. To gain access into the case, the front glass panel can be removed by loosening the thumb screw. The tab sticking out allows you to pull the glass out, and the glass is also supported magnetically, so it doesn't fall when you loosen the thumb screw. The top panel is released by undoing the 2 thumb screws. Using the pulling tab, you can pull out and then up to take the glass off. The rear of the case has plenty of finger room to pull the back panel out. The panel is secured by small ball nodules which enter the plastic clip to hold it in place. The magnets also help to aid this. The back panel also has loads of breathing holes, which is much needed for a case that is surrounded by glass. The front glass panel is structural in the sense that it supports all the other glass panels. At the top, it has a resting position for both the front main window and the top panel, so it is supporting the structure, keeping things square. This is how Lian Li avoids having a support beam running along the front, giving the Vision that unique look. The glass joints are also cut at a 45-degree angle for that seamless look. If it was square, I think it would have looked a little odd. The front panel, while not intended to be removed, can be removed by loosening the thumb screw on the inside, the screw at the front, and the 3 screws on the rear, which will reveal another 4 screws on the front. Our last exterior section is the rear, and I'll touch on the rest as we progress through the build. However, I wanted to highlight the included cable tie holes along the power supply. So these could be used for when you have your USB coming out of your motherboard. You can cable tie them to here, even the display coming from the GPU, to keep it all nice and clean at the rear. Taking a look at the rear interior, this panel right here acts to hide all of the cables, but it also doubles up as an SSD mounting tray. You could fit 3 2.5-inch SSDs along the back panel here. This tray is on a swinging hinge and it can be lifted off. And when it's closed, it is held in place by magnets. We also have 2 hard drive mounting cages which are completely removable by releasing the thumb screw at the back and then lifting up and pulling it out of the tab. That allows you to fit another 2 2.5-inch SSDs or another 2 3.5-inch hard drives. Now, there were 2 ways to install a power supply. You can either install it the regular way by inserting the power supply like so, with the case still all put together, or you can completely remove the bracket by undoing these 4 screws. Now, a regular power supply around 170mm long should fit quite easily. The issues start rising when you introduce something longer than that 170mm. You either end up having no space for your cables to plug in because of these cable holders here, or the power supply itself will collide with these cable holders. Luckily for us, Lian Li has thought of a solution and made these all removable, so we can actually make these move up and out of the way of the power supply. Now what this does for us is gives us around 280mm worth of power supply room. The case can fit up to eATX size motherboards, but if you did want to use MATX or ITX, they actually have a bracket that can flip over so that you can utilize the top GPU expansion slot. Now, as well as installing the motherboard inside the case, you can actually completely remove the motherboard tray. You can do this by releasing the thumb screw on the inside, and you can also release the thumb screw on the back side, and that'll release the tray, which you can slide out and pull out. So for today's system, we're actually not going to be going with the Corsair radiators because they are not as wide as the EK ones. The older EK ones are about the same width as the Corsair ones as well, so we're not going to use them. But the thermal take radiators are the widest ones that we have on hand. So if these fit, then everything below it should also fit. So starting with the rear of the case in the standard motherboard layout, you can actually fit a single 120mm fan or a 120mm radiator in this place. Now, radiator thickness compatibility is not really an issue here. The only way that something will obstruct it is tubes coming out of a water block, but at that point, you're literally covered for every single 120mm radiator thickness on the market. Now, I don't have any thermal take radiators on hand in 120mm variant, but they are 135mm wide. That particular radiator would not fit in this space. You actually only have 134mm of clearance before you are hitting the case edge. Now, obviously there is zero clearance issues up the top as well because there is no radiator bracket. It's just a glass panel. You're not gonna have any fans up there, any radiators, so you can actually put this up as high as you want. Now, if I did want to use a radiator that was more than 134mm wide in this particular spot, the way to combat that would be to put the fan on the inside, like so, and therefore the radiator is actually sticking out a little bit further, and then it doesn't matter if it overlaps a little bit. The glass will still close on the case as well. The bottom radiator mount is completely removable by removing these two screws. Now, the bottom radiator bracket is compatible with 3 140mm fans or 3 120mm fans, and it cannot fit a 420mm radiator according to Lian Li, so a 360mm radiator is the maximum. However, I do believe I could fit a 420mm radiator in here. The problem is the max length of the radiator can only be 465mm, but there's also a maximum width that you could go. We only have about 52mm worth of play before we hit the bottom of the bracket. So if you really wanted a 420mm radiator in here, it has to be super thin, maybe even thinner fans, for a max width of 52mm. Now at that point, I can see why Lian Li have suggested that 360mm is the minimum, because at that point, a thicker 360mm radiator will have more cooling than a real thin 420mm radiator. So this is the thickest GPU that I have on hand. It is 75mm, and I wanted to use that to give you guys a worst case scenario for radiator compatibility at the bottom. Now, the radiator itself is 64mm thick, and the fans combined with the radiator are 90mm together. And to be honest, I wouldn't feel comfortable going much thicker than this because I want to allow for the GPU to breathe a little bit. Now, the gap between the top of the fans and the bottom of the GPU is about 15mm, which I think is adequate enough, and I wouldn't want to go any closer. But for those of you who are interested, there's about 105mm from the bracket down the bottom until you hit the bottom of the GPU. Now, let's be real, if you are looking to install some thick boy radiators, then you're more than likely wanting to water cool your GPU as well. Putting a water block on the GPU obviously reduces a lot of that size and thickness from the GPU, so you've actually got a lot more compatibility. Speaking of compatibility, with this particular water block, you actually now have 158mm worth of play before you actually hit the bottom of the GPU block. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you do decide to go with a radiator that comes up close, are you going to be taking your ports out the bottom, and are you going to be laying your cables down and underneath? Because those are all things to consider. Even with our particular configuration, you could still have the ports coming out down below the GPU. You could still have the GPU cables going below and you can still run a push-pull configuration. Now, bringing in fresh air from below is also not an issue. There is actually a 27mm gap between the desk and the bottom of the case, and that actually increases to 40mm because the radiator bracket is actually up a little higher than the bottom of the case. Now, in terms of cable space between the motherboard and the radiator, you have about 25mm worth of play, which is plenty to work with. So let's talk about compatibility at this back section right here. You can actually fit two 140mm fans, or you can fit three 120mm fans. Radiator compatibility, you are limited to a 360mm radiator or a 280mm radiator. Now, in this current configuration, our first limiting factor in terms of radiator thickness is going to be hitting the back of the GPU. Between the radiator bracket and the back of the GPU, we only have 75mm worth of play. Now, with our fan thickness being 27mm, we only have 48mm worth of thickness to play with for our radiator. Now, this particular radiator is from EK, and it is 45mm thick, making it pretty much our limit for compatibility. We should have about 3mm worth of clearance if my maths was correct. And there you have it, guys. We have about a 3mm gap between the fans and the back of the GPU, so I'd be comfortable recommending a 45mm radiator for this particular configuration. Now, at the rear of the case, we've actually got like 53mm worth of room to play with here. So we could actually put the fans on the back side to give us more radiator compatibility in the front. So now that we have the fans installed at the back, we can actually utilize all 75mm worth of radiator space in the front. And so I managed to put in a 64mm radiator, and we still have 11mm worth of play until we hit the GPU. Now, of course, if we have a water-blocked graphics card, then 9 times out of 10, the size is not going to be an issue in terms of running into the radiator. So our new radiator compatibility now becomes the thickness between the bracket at the back all the way up to our radiator sitting down below. And so without the GPU limiting us, between the radiator and the radiator bracket, we have 98mm worth of play. That allows me to fit a much thicker radiator, or I could do a setup like this where I have a push-pull configuration with the fans being at the rear and 3 fans at the front. And you can see we still have some play in between the radiator and the fans. But you know, one of the coolest things about this particular bracket is you can actually pull this tab and completely remove it and flip it around so that you have more radiator space on the inside. By flipping it around, we now have 140mm worth of play when it comes to a water-blocked GPU. And with an air-cooled GPU installed, we now have around 116mm from the fan bracket to the back of the GPU. Now, speaking of GPUs, this case has endless compatibility in terms of length. You can fit up to 463mm long. Lian Li also supplies a GPU support mounting bracket with plenty of customization. You can actually slide these little notches up and down. Now, we actually have a whole second case layout. By removing the motherboard tray and this bracket down below and putting that up the top, we can move the motherboard down, which changes some compatibility a little bit. So in this motherboard mode, what does this actually mean for us? What extras do we get out of this, if any? Well, for starters, apart from all of the rubber grommets around the edge, Lian Li has also included these rubber grommets to cover up these holes here on the inside. Now, they have left a little slit for cables to route through, so it kind of just acts like another grommet. In this motherboard layout, you also now have space for a 240mm radiator. Obviously, a bigger radiator compatibility than the previous layout. But what you are losing here is the distance between the GPU, so you can't put a thicker radiator on the bottom. Now, in my opinion, a thicker radiator on the bottom is worth more than an extra 120mm worth of radiator at the rear here. So I personally feel like there is really no need for this motherboard layout, but we're gonna test compatibility anyway. Now, of course, my thoughts would be much different if we had radiator brackets up the top, because now it is allowing for more room for radiator compatibility up there. Now, when we get into the lower motherboard mode, this is where this bracket becomes important. Right now, as it stands, you would have to have this bracket as is if you had an MATX or an ITX motherboard installed. This would mean that you could not actually use a 240mm radiator with any of those motherboards. It simply doesn't fit. By switching it over, I gained a little bit more room and I was able to install my 240mm radiator. So besides the 134mm constraints in the width of the radiator, we also have a height constraint of 280 millimeters. This thermal take radiator is actually exactly 280 millimeters, and if this port here was actually on this side, it would not actually work in this position because the port would push it past the 280 millimeters and it would collide with this bracket here. Now, with our GPU installed, we don't actually have a lot of room to play here. 53 mil to be exact. A simple 30 millimeter radiator with some 27 mil fans wouldn't even fit under this GPU. You'd have to get something even thinner. And this is why I question, why does this mode really exist for this case? Now granted, once we put the GPU water block on, we are gonna get more space to play with, so we'll try that out. I mean, the only thing I can really think of is maybe it will benefit air cooling. You could still fit the 3 120 millimeter fans down the bottom, your 3 120 millimeter fans at the side, and now instead of one 120 millimeter fan, you can fit 2 at the rear here as well. But in terms of water cooling, doesn't benefit the case whatsoever. In fact, if the motherboard stayed in its original position, you probably could have saved costs on the case manufacturing itself by not having all of this extra stuff that is really not usable in terms of water cooling. But hey, I understand some people are going to be air cooling and they might prefer the look of 2 fans at the rear here. Now, when it comes to a water cooled GPU, we do have a little bit more room to play with here. We have 106 millimeters from the radiator bracket to the bottom of the water block on the GPU. So in this particular configuration, you could still fit your 64 millimeter radiator and your fans in with a water block to GPU. However, you wouldn't be able to have any tubes coming out from the bottom of the GPU. They would both have to come out of the top. And also your cables don't really have enough room to route underneath the GPU. You'd have to bring them up and over. Now, this is significantly less compatibility than if the motherboard were to be in the standard layout position. You had so much more room to work with there, and you could have a much thicker radiator here if you needed. The rear compatibility here still does not change at all. We're still dealing with the same constraints as the original motherboard layout. Now, in terms of reservoir compatibility, one of my favorite go-tos is actually the EK240 FLT pump res combo. It's a D5 pump res, plenty of room, mounts straight to the fan, and we have plenty of height above it, so we can put in something taller if need be. Now, you can also mount plenty of tube res combos to the back fans as well, and we have about another 52 mil worth of play above the FLT 240 until we hit the top glass. And for a second option, you can always mount your reservoir to the bottom fan. Now, in this particular configuration, you have 328 mil worth of play from this bottom fan until you hit the top glass. Now, if you wanted to keep the GPU on air, there is not a lot of radiator compatibility, but I have come up with a few. Number one, with this thickness radiator, you could install an FLT 120 D5 pump res combo up the top here. Number two, you could potentially mount it off of the side here. So there we have it, guys. That is a real intense water cooling breakdown of this case. And if you guys want to see temperatures, we are actually going to be completing this build, and that video will release the following week, so stay tuned. And if there's anything else you would like to know about this case, I can address it in that video, so let me know down in the comments below. Now, this case does come in black and white. The white is $10 dearer than the black, and the black is going to retail for $139.99 US. Now, considering all of the support for this case, I do think that is actually a pretty good deal. So I would certainly recommend it. So at the moment, I would recommend it, but I would like to see the temperatures first. So stay tuned for next week's video, and we'll see you all in the next one.